Welcome back for another episode of Forage Focus. I'm your host, Christine Gelley, and today we are going to be talking about timing your pasture mowing appropriately for good weed control. And I have a special guest with me today. His name is Ted Wiseman. Ted, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Christine, I'm the Extension Educator for Perry County for OSU Extension. I've been in Extension for 20 years with different positions off and on, but grew up in Perry County, grew up on a livestock farm, crop farm, so really enjoy the job.
Excellent. Thank you for joining me on Forage Focus. I don't think we've had you as a guest yet, but we have been working together on some projects throughout my short career thus far with Extension. And one of those is a project that's 5 years in and about to be wrapped up, and it is related to timed mowing of pastures. We have some other colleagues that work with us on that project, including our neighbor Chris Penrose in Morgan County, retired educator Mark Landefeld from Monroe County, and our Extension Operations Director Jeff McCutcheon, who was formerly the A&R educator in Morrow County. So Ted, I have some questions before we really talk in depth about our project. You know, why is weed control in the pasture such a big deal? Why are we clipping them? Aren't the animals supposed to do that?
Well, if you can really intensively do it, some people have been successful with getting the animals to do it, but in the springtime, it's just really tough to get ahead of the forages when they're growing. So we have to go in and mow them, and sometimes we get some invasives or some toxic weeds or some problem weeds come in, and we have to go in and clip them back, but that's still not a total control. So.
Right, and there's some weeds that can be more detrimental than other, especially those that may be poisonous, or those that may have damaging items attached, damaging physiological structures like awns or thorns that can reduce animal intake. So weeds that have those characteristics are definitely a top concern, and not all of our problem weeds are going to be responsive to mowing. Why do we consider mowing pastures for control? What's beneficial about mowing strategies?
Well, the mowing strategy, a plant's whole goal in life is to produce a seed. So if we can time it just right to knock the seed heads off or before they even develop, and that'll force those grass plants especially to keep tillering, to fill in the pastures, make them thicker, lusher, and keep things going to maximize the nutrient value that we can get out of that ground.
Economically speaking, Ted, do you think that for the average pasture manager in Ohio, that using mowing strategies is economical for them based on equipment and labor and time?
I mean, anything we do has a cost to it, but I think if most of us aren't able to get in and mow pastures when we really would like to, just because other things going on and the weather kind of directs us which way we're going on the farm, is whether we're making hay or putting crops in the ground or taking them off. But yeah, there's several options out there. I mean, a lot of folks will use a bush hog, brush hog, whichever one you want to name it. But I've used a sickle bar mower, and I really like it on some of my fields.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that our pasture mowing results may vary dramatically depending on when we're actually able to get out there and do the work. But for the most part, if we can get that timing right to at least reduce seed production, we're eventually going to see some good results as outcome of implementing mowing.
Right, and we've got some invasives like the autumn olives, the multiflora roses that the animals just aren't going to eat anyway. So if we get those coming in, we got to go in and knock them back. So that really helps there too.
Right. And something I would like to talk about here shortly are differences between different types of life cycles of common weeds and how that's going to play into mowing strategies. So a lot of the weeds that we wind up trying to control in our pastures may be summer annual plants. And what that implies is that these plants are typically going to germinate in spring, late spring, and set seed by mid-July. And their whole purpose in life, like you said earlier, Ted, is to produce as much seed as possible, as quick as possible, and then they're going to die or senesce for the season. Their method of reproduction is to come back from seed. So in this case, many summer annuals can be knocked back by mowing unless they are of types that are going to flower below the height of the mower deck.
Yeah, and the one we had in this study that was a real problem for us was cocklebur. We went and knocked the tops off of it, but that plant has the ability to still produce a flower and produce a seed. So that may be where we'd have to use something like herbicides to aid with this, but it just, depends on what your starting point is and what your management style is. Every operation is different.
Now, how about those winter annuals? Our winter annuals, they're going to germinate and grow at a different time frame. Typically, these are going to germinate in the fall, and then we will see them flower in the springtime. In that case, brush hogging is usually not a very effective control for winter annual weeds, but also I don't see as many issues with winter annuals as I do with summer annuals. We do, however, have some that are poisonous, don't we, Ted?
Yeah, there's a lot of plants out there that are poisonous. I mean, good grief, you read the literature and you'd be afraid to turn your animals out on pasture, but most of the time we only have to worry about these poisonous plants, especially in a drought year and when nothing else is growing and you're basically forcing the animal to eat those, whatever's out there. So you just want to watch your pastures. With pastures, you're a forage farmer first. You've got to pay attention to what the plants are doing, what the weather's doing, and then manage with the animals from there.
Absolutely. Another life cycle of weeds that we're going to see in our production systems are those that are biennials. And these ones can be a bit tricky for the pasture manager. A biennial is going to produce only vegetative growth in the first year. It won't be until the second year that they flower. We do have some perennials that act like biennials in that the first year they don't go to seed, but they do produce flower in the second, third, or subsequent years after. And usually, pasture managers don't notice they have these weeds until year 2 when they flower and set seed. And at that point, we get behind on control. So control of these plants is best when they are in the rosette stage, which happens in year 1. And in that case, since they're not flowering, mowing strategies are likely not as effective for biennials, but can be depending on their growth height.
Yeah, and there's a lot of plants like you're describing there, Christine, that fall application with a herbicide is ideal to take care of those. A lot of times we're thinking in the spring, getting them before they come out, but the fall is a good time to get those in the rosette stage and not as much foliage area that we need to cover.
Right. And if we don't catch those in year 1 and we get to year 2 where they are going to flower and producing seed, mowing strategies can definitely help us gain some ground and buy some time for control. But it is ideal to scout for those in year 1. One that we have prevalent in my area and we have a hit on is spotted knapweed. And that's one of those that behaves like a biennial. It sets seed quite quickly and it does flower below the mower deck. So we're going to need to use an integrated approach for that one. When we look at perennials, there are quite a few perennial plants that seem to be pretty responsive to mowing strategies, things like ironweed and goldenrod, Johnson grass to some extent. Ted, any tips on perennial weed management?
With the perennials, like the ones you just mentioned, those some people have been successful with using a weed wiper going across their field instead of having to spray everything. And that's worked fairly well for some folks. Just depends on what else you got in the field. But that's another strategy that you can go after those. But I think brush hogging is a pretty easy way to go after those that you just described.
Right, if you don't have access to a weed wiper. And by the way, you can construct your own weed wipers. There are some out there available for rent. They're not too expensive to buy. And they can be effective tools, but they are a little bit more difficult to use if your ground isn't level. They do have a tendency to drip to the end of the sponge, the wiper, if you're not quite level or you're a little too saturated on the wiper. But a very inventive and helpful tool. And if that doesn't work for you, mowing is a very similar strategy.
Yeah, and the weed wipers, they do work good. The only downfall that I find with them is clean out can be a challenge, depending on what kind of herbicide you're running through it. So that is just something to consider.
Absolutely. The ones that I know of that are available for rent, you have one choice of herbicide to use with those, just to avoid the risk of residue left in the sponge. So, right, there's multiple approaches you can take to this, and in pastures, it tends to be more difficult than our monoculture systems because we have lots of different kinds of plants, different life cycles, different growth heights, different fertility preferences. Uh, Sometimes our pasture fields are on pretty rough terrain or intense slopes. We have our livestock tracking through the area, making paths where weeds can take hold. And then when it comes to herbicide selection, it can be difficult to make a good choice based on which plants are your priorities to keep and which ones you're trying to eliminate.
Yeah, and if you are going to use herbicides, you really want to pay attention to the labels because some of those, the grazing restrictions aren't that bad, but they do have some pretty lengthy residuals to them. A county I worked in a few years ago, an individual had sprayed a herbicide on a hayfield, baled it, fed it to his cattle, perfectly fine, perfectly legal, but took that manure and mixed it with some mulch. And then that mulch, I don't know whether it was a mulching company that this individual owned or was another company, but they took that mulch and put it around some really nice landscapes in some suburban areas and killed all the plants, and that got into a pretty nasty mess there.
That would be unfortunate, and that could have been avoided with careful consideration of the label and following through with knowing where that residue wound up.
Yeah, some of those residues can be 16, 18 months, so just be careful and be sure you know what you're doing, even if you're not going to be feeding hay. If you've got a really nice pasture with some legumes in it, and then you run cattle and mix them through the other field, they could take out some plants too.
Right. So if our listeners have now decided that maybe mowing pastures is something they should do or maybe something they could do better, let's talk some more about the experiment that we've been working on.
Okay, the experiment had 8 different treatments, and we had it's replicated in 4 different plots. Each treatment, we had a control, which we did nothing. We didn't mow it at all, and then we mowed in June, July, August, and September. And then we also mowed in June and August, July and September, and then we mowed every month in June, July, August, and September. Then we go back in and we took samples each month. The cattle were grazed in these pastures once a month. We went in the first of the month, collected our samples. The last 3 years, we separated the weeds from the forages, and we dried those down to get our dry matter ratings or dry matter amounts on them. And then we also visually just looked at the plots and we ranked them as to what score we would give them for the population of weeds that were in those plots.
Right. And we did see some distinct pressures from certain types of weeds. Some that I remember seeing, we'd mentioned cockleburr before. We had a lot of cockleburr in our study plots. Also Canada thistle, horse nettle. We didn't see too many grassy weeds in this section, although they had been problematic on other parts of the farm. When we started, we had quite a bit of ironweed, but that seemed to start to fade out towards the end. Do you agree?
Yes, yes. And one thing that we did start to see on some of these plots that we had more white clover coming in and some of them with the different mowing treatments.
Right, and we do suspect that that could be in combination with animal preference for grazing, since the animals were able to come into the pasture and graze as well. So that could be a complex explanation for what all is exactly happening there. But certainly, with additional light infiltration and less competition, our legumes were more successful in those stands that had been mowed.
Right, and as you'd mentioned, Christine, we're just in the process of compiling all this data for the 5 years that we have, and hopefully we can get that out soon to everyone. But we had a couple interesting years in there with the tremendous rainfall, so it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Absolutely, it will be. And just if we could give some people some summaries of what we saw, which combinations or which strategies seem to perform better just from an overall glance at the study?
Well, if you just wanted to reduce weed pressure, mowing every month did help, but it also reduces the amount of forages that we had in those plots. Just glancing at it, looking at it briefly, this could change when we compile all the data, but it looks like July is a pretty good month to mow in as far as managing weeds, maximizing forage production. Doing nothing wasn't the worst in some years, oddly enough. But, mowing every month just wouldn't be economical, and I don't know anybody that would have time to even do that. on their pastures. But some of the mowing strategies seem to help. We did have some plots that were problem children that just whatever was done to them, the cocklebur just was there. So
we certainly had a lot of local support in getting this study done. We are really thankful for the staff at the Eastern Agricultural Research Station here in Caldwell. They are just fabulous to work with, very responsive, and we're so thankful for their input. Our study is influenced by location, so depending on where your farm is located, your weed pressure may vary, as well as the species that you see. And based on weather conditions, your mowing time may also need to be adjusted.
Yeah, Christine, I mean, it took a lot of work. The crew is really busy there at the station, but just really want to thank them for going in and every month and doing these trials and doing the mowing for us when we asked them to, and just really supportive. I mean, it is a research farm, but there's a lot of projects going on there and just some wonderful folks that work there. And we just can't say enough good things about them.
Absolutely. And in different circumstances, we would welcome you to come out and visit the farm and show you what we've been working on in person. But we are thankful for the opportunity to do so virtually and look forward to the day when we can welcome you back to the farm for a field day.
Yeah, and hopefully, like I said, we'll get this put together here real soon, and then we'll get it out to everyone. And then if you have questions after you look at it, by all means, give us a call. We may not have some data in what you would want to see, but we'd be more than willing to share that with anyone.
Absolutely. And Ted, as we look at options for integrated pest management, our weeds being the pest in this case, of course, mowing, clipping, and herbicides aren't our only options for control. Weeds are always a symptom of some kind of a problem. It seems to be that fertility is often an issue. What notes do we have for people on that regard?
Yeah, it all starts with your soil fertility. I mean, a lot of us, we're lime poor and fertilizer poor in our pasture fields. It's just, if whatever you can do to get that fertility up, because once you throw that seed on the ground, it can't get up and move. So, and then it also falls into your management style. We get calls from folks that want to reseed their pastures just because they're horrid. But if you go to reseed a pasture, my biggest problem with that is I think you need to wait at least 2 years, or be very careful when you run those animals through the first time, because those seedlings have to get established. That root system has to get going. A lot of people will reseed their pasture and turn them in too soon. And, it's always been said, if you reseed it, but you're going to do the same management, you're going to wind up with the same weeds and the same problems you had before you started and put all that expense in it.
I think patience is one of the hardest things to come by when you're looking at rehabbing or replanting a pasture, because we have to manage for the plants before we can manage well for the animals.
Correct. And then it also changes droughts, wet years. You got sacrifice areas that you may feed in through the winter and spring. Those are pretty tricky to get reestablished, because you're just going to continually be beating them up every year. But if you're able to put in a heavy use pad, those are wonderful.
And speaking of those livestock, multi-species grazing is another option that people can look at to better utilize the plants that are growing in their pastures and sometimes get some additional weed control.
Yeah, goats and sheep make an excellent addition to a cattle herd. The only problem there is the fencing. You do have to, takes a little bit better fence for those. But sheep and goats, they will browse some forbs or our weeds, and they just really complement it really well. And the market's pretty good for sheep and goats right now too.
Absolutely it is. Now, I've got a question here related to horse production as well. We have quite a few horse producers that are struggling with some weed management issues in their pastures or their exercise lots, and that is partially related to the grazing preferences of the animal as well as management. Do you have any horse-specific advice?
Yeah, with horses are going to stomp out just as much as they will graze out. I think it takes a little more pasture for a horse, a little bit different cut style of management. If you could set up different paddocks just to run the horses through, horses will graze a little bit different. Cattle will tend to graze around the perimeter or in circles, or horses just graze back and forth. But their horses are pretty particular what they're going to eat, and depending on what you're doing with that animal, if it's just recreational or if it's a performance horse, you got to really pay attention to the nutrition of your pastures.
Regardless of which species you are growing or marketing, there are benefits to adding potentially some playmates in the pasture too to get better utilization.
Yep. And then don't forget the time of the year when snow's going to be melting here. We could do some frost seeding if you wanted to add in some legumes to your pastures. It's a different topic, but most of the time it's our legumes that frost seed better than our grass seed just because of the weight of the seed and getting that soil contact.
And if we can do that in a time frame where the animals can even help us deposit some of that seed into the soil, that's helpful, but we do want to get them out of there while the seed is germinating and trying to establish. Hoof traffic can be helpful, but it's not particularly helpful once the seedlings are up.
Yeah, you got to give them time. Again, we're managing those grass plants and those legumes. We're not managing the animals. We're managing the grasses with them.
Absolutely. Let's revisit some of the tips we've given on herbicide use. What's the 5-word advice that we can give people regarding herbicides? Read the label.
Read the label.
Follow instructions.
Yes, ma'am. Just make sure you understand what product you're putting out there. You know what the grazing restrictions are on them, and by all means know what the carryover or the residual time is on those, because some of them are pretty lengthy.
Indeed, and that comes into play too with reseeding pastures. Even if you're frost seeding, some of those can have restrictions on when your legumes will thrive. So if frost seeding is a go-to for you, make sure it's compatible with your herbicides. All in all, we want to combine all of these strategies together to get the best possibility for control. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for weed control in the pasture, but if you can implement more than one strategy, you're likely to be more successful.
Yes, and the weather is a huge part of that too, Christine. You got to monitor your fields, know what's growing, know what stages they're at. But if we've got an extremely wet year or an extremely dry year, each year is a little different.
Indeed it is. Ted, thank you so much for your time today to cover this topic on Forage Focus. I do have one other question for you, and it is timely. Right now it's February as we're having this conversation. I have heard some folks discussing mowing pasture now. Why would they consider doing that, and what are your thoughts?
The only reason I could think of, and I sure wouldn't want to be on some of my fields on the hillsides with the snow we have and the ice on the ground, but the only benefit that I can think of that would give if somebody had some old Flora Rose or some autumn olive, and they were wanting to get them beat down before spring got here to open up that ground a little bit more. But that would be the only thing that I could think of that would be beneficial right now.
Maybe if you're just longing for some additional time on the tractor and need an excuse to be outside, that works, but it's not going to really aid us for much weed control. And in some cases, it may actually spread more weed seed than you had deposited to begin with. So, as we've talked about today, the ideal time to clip pastures is when you're going to effectively reduce seed production and seed deposition in the soil.
That's absolutely right, Christine. It's a timing game. And like we said, every year is just a little bit different.
It is, and we look forward to being with all of you for additional years to come and seeing what comes to us with various seasons. Ted, if people have additional questions for either you or I, our information is on the screen. What's the best way for them to reach you?
Either call the office. All of our offices are open. However, a lot of us are working remotely. Just call the office ahead of time. We can come out to your farms. We can meet with you in our offices. Safety protocols are in place, but they can either call the office or feel free to email me. Be happy to discuss any questions they have.
Same goes from my perspective. Thank you for your time today, Ted, and thank you to all our viewers and listeners out there. We wish you the best of luck as we head towards spring, and if you have any questions about frost seeding as well, feel free to reach out.